To talk about. Let's get to our panel. Joe Madison is a longtime civil rights activist and the host of a program on Sirius XM's Urban View channel. With us from Boston is Julio Ricardo Varela. He's the digital media director at Futuro Media Group and the founder of LatinoRebels.com. Amy Holmes is with us from New York. She's a political commentator and columnist for the Swiss weekly Die Weltwoche. And former CNN Washington bureau chief Frank Sesno is the director of George Washington University's School of Media and Public Affairs right here in Washington, D.C. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Frank, let me start with you. Almost 24 people on the Democrat side running for the nomination, and I will also not name all 22 of them. Very diverse group, though. More than 1/3 are women, 2 are black men. We have one of Mexican heritage, another is Taiwanese American, 1 is gay, and 2 men are in their 70s. Quite a field. What do you make of it?
It's quite a field. It could be a deck of cards. What I make of it is these are people who have something they need to say. They are motivated by their ability to connect with people through the digital world that now exists, which can fund them and support them. And there is a rich opportunity for them to speak out, because the Democratic Party, generally speaking, is riding on a high tide of indignation and outrage over the presidency of Donald Trump. But they are not all going to survive. Only in America do we have a presidential campaign that is in full swing a year and a half before the election, and a lot is going to change. The economy could change. The relationship with China, with Mexico, with Iran could completely undermine things. And as Nathan pointed out earlier, even with this large field of 22, already we are seeing a winnowing, because you can't, on a television show, and a voter can't in their minds, weed through 22 viable candidates. So that starts, and we'll start to have the debate soon. They're actually going to be held over 2 days, because you can't get 22 people on a stage. So we'll start seeing a shaking out. I think we already are, actually, with some of the candidates who are clearly gaining a lot of traction, and others who are struggling, such as Beto O'Rourke, who was a huge sensation in Texas not very long ago.
Right. Let me go to Amy Holmes in New York. Amy, what's your assessment of this huge Democratic field that we're looking at right now? And in your view, who has the best chance of taking on Trump and beating him?
Well, we're seeing the ever-expanding Democratic field. The governor of Montana, he just jumped in today. Running for the presidency is a great way also to raise your name ID and create a national profile. A lot of these politicians, I think, are looking at 2016. And remember, Bernie Sanders was way in the back. Nobody ever thought that Bernie Sanders would gain the traction that he did. And, he really gave Hillary Clinton a run for the money, which puts him in a front-runner status. Here we are in going into 2020. So I think a lot of these candidates are looking at that. They're also hoping that former Vice President Joe Biden slips up, that his commanding lead might, whittle down based on his own gaffes or not appealing to the progressive voters in the Democratic Party. But I think the fact that Joe Biden is so far out in the front right now, it shows a Democratic Party that's actually more unified than necessarily 22 candidates would suggest. That the Democratic Party and their voters, they're looking for the best candidate they think will be able to take on President Trump and beat him. And so far, at least in polling, it looks like Democrats are pointing the finger at Joe Biden to be able to do that.
Joe, what is your view? According to recent polling, the top 5 candidates are Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, Warren, Biden, and Buttigieg. Now, we know that winning the White House is having national appeal, attracting a lot of money, of course, and also bringing together very diverse coalitions. We saw that with in the manner in which Barack Obama won the White House. Who has the ability to bring together all these coalitions?
Well, that's the real question, because as your previous guest was saying, you have this diverse group of people. I think, to answer your question directly, if I had to point to anyone, I think it would be Joe Biden, because he has the experience of doing that in Congress and then in the Senate. What I think will be the Democrats' strong card, and I'm thinking ahead, that was 500 and some days ahead, will be that individual who brings this entire group together. And that's going to be a lot of voters. If you notice, Trump's popularity as far as the base is concerned, is there.
Right.
They're not going anywhere. His problem has been adding to that base. And I think what's going to happen is what everyone has said, you're going to have a drop-off quickly, financially, polling-wise, and it's going to boil down to just a handful of people. But I would just answer your question. I think of all the people out there, Biden probably has the experience because he's going to go down the middle.
Right. Joe, the point is, having experience is one thing. It also gives you a very long track record for people to attack.
Well, that's true.
Right.
There's no question about that. And the reality is that he anticipates he will be, but he's going to be attacked primarily by his opponents. And I can almost guarantee they're going to drop off one by one. That's just something he has to put up with. I mean, but all of them have a track record. Even the mayor has a problem with African American voters. There's not one of them that doesn't have a problem because you know why? They've all been politicians.
Yeah. All right, let me go to Julio Varela. Julio, let's talk about Kamala Harris. She's the former Attorney General from California, been a prosecutor there as well. She's been talking about race, religion, and immigration on the campaign trail. And immigration is emerging as one of these big key issues for this election. Let's listen to part of what she had to say.
When white supremacists march and murder in Charlottesville or massacre innocent worshipers in a Pittsburgh synagogue, that's not our America. When we have children in cages crying for their mothers and fathers, don't you dare call that border security. That's a human rights abuse.
So, Julio, how big an issue will immigration be, the border as well? How big an issue will that be? And who's the best Democratic candidate to take on Trump on this issue?
Well, it's interesting because obviously it's going to be one of the hugest issues because Trump has already begun to use it as a campaign issue. Every time he seems to be in trouble, there's always an immigration announcement or another, change in policy. But no one's talking about the person that actually presented the most comprehensive immigration plan, and he's the Mexican American in the race and a mayor, Julian Castro, who really took a plan about immigration about a month ago and has earned kudos to the point that even people like Senator Elizabeth Warren have applauded him for coming out with it. With that said, this one's a problem for Democrats, and it's one of those uncomfortable truths that Democrats sometimes don't know what to do with, because you have people like Biden who it's already been on record that he was voting for fences and saying that Mexicans would be bringing drugs into the border 10 years ago, kind of using similar language than the current president is using. And then when you take someone like Kamala Harris, who has had issues in California with immigrant rights activists for her sort of enforcement emphasis on immigration, there's a lot here that it's just not so cut and dry when it comes to Democrats. And it's a very easy move by Trump to do the whataboutism in this case. And that's why he's been very effective on immigration and getting his base rallied up.
Joe, you agree this is going to be an issue for the Democrats, immigration?
Oh, absolutely. There's no ifs, ands, buts about it, and it should be. I mean, and both parties ought to be held accountable. But let's be quite candid. Donald Trump's record on immigration has caused a lot of consternation. And the reality is, as I'm listening to people talk, I think what's really going to happen, or what I'd like to see happen, is let them have this debate. Let it be a very spirited debate. Now, and then put that platform together, because that's really, I'm still thinking of the convention. So you're going to take a little from this candidate, a little from that candidate, and then you're going to put a platform together that hopefully the Democrats will say this will appeal to a broader base of people than what Donald Trump has. Donald Trump's problem is going to be broadening his base.
Right.
Now, and let us just be quite candid about that. That's really going to be, we forget. How he won was he was strategic, he was clever, he won by going into states that Hillary wouldn't go into, that she thought she had. I don't think that mistake is going to be made. I'm looking at the Democratic convention, and I'm seeing this candidate's base, this candidate's position, that candidate's position, and they're going to put a platform together, and that's going to be what Donald Trump is going to have to run against.
Frank, we keep hearing Joe Biden being in the lead, but what does he actually bring to the race? Because if you look at some of what he's done in the past, I mean, Julio just mentioned the fact that he supported, for instance, border fences. He had a very controversial role in the Senate hearings for Clarence Thomas, his treatment of Anita Hill, we hear about very often. He was a sponsor of a major criminal bill, which many people say led to the mass incarceration that we see right now. He's known for supporting big corporations, big banks.
And he's run 2 presidential campaigns that failed.
Right.
I've covered them and I've watched them. And it's often said that Joe Biden needs an editor. He talks too much. And when he talks too much, he gets in trouble. Right. But I don't, I think if he handles it right, if he's a confident candidate and he doesn't apologize, this is an odd thing to say, but Donald Trump has taught politicians, don't apologize. Don't apologize for who you are. Be genuine, be assertive, explain, and go forward.
See, I disagree with that.
Well, but if Biden, I think Biden and all candidates have to be careful about acknowledging that their views can evolve, they can do that. Yeah. But if they sound wishy-washy, if they sound weak, Donald Trump is going to swoop in. He's shown that again and again. He knows, he's like a boxer. Right. You open up a cut above an eyebrow, and that's where he goes, and he goes, and he goes, and he goes. Yeah. Okay. And the Democrats are in a very, very perilous place on this issue of immigration.
Oh, he has to be a straight talker.
So if Biden is going to deal with his past, but connect it to the future, he's got to be able to talk about evolution, but not dwell on it and not sound like he's apologizing for himself.
Okay. Amy, we're almost 2/3 of the way into the show, and we haven't talked about Russia. We haven't heard the word Russia yet. The investigation is complete. Right. We've had the report. Democrats now want more investigations. We've heard of another investigation into the investigation right now. Are people really interested? Is this going to feature in any way in this election?
Well, it is featuring in the Democratic primary in this sense. Senator Elizabeth Warren, you remember when she launched her campaign with that DNA testing. It was a major flop, blew up in her face. Since then, she has focused on her progressive policies. And among the Democratic candidates, the frontrunners, she's been the most vocal about wanting to impeach President Trump. And that's helped her with Democratic voters. That's helped her, pull in those further left, more progressive voters who want to see aggressive action against President Trump. But I want to get back to the issue of illegal immigration. This is, Frank said, it's a perilous issue that Democratic voters are further to the left on this than is the sort of centrist American voter who these candidates would have to appeal to if they were, to go into the general election. And we've already seen Joe Biden, who, as we know, loves to talk. He also loves to pander. And in Los Angeles just recently, he seemed to suggest that he'd be open to the idea of granting entitlements to illegal immigrants. This is not popular with the American voting public, more generally speaking. While it is popular with the Democratic base, that creates, a conflict for these candidates as they're possibly, wanting to take on President Trump.
Joe, what do you make of, Amy just mentioned Senator Elizabeth Warren, her candidacy. Her big mantra has been, I've got a plan for that. Talk about something that she's got a plan for that.
I think one of the things I have enjoyed about her is that she goes into the lion's den. I mean, she went into Mississippi, right, and she spoke to African Americans in reference to the vote and voter suppression. Then she went somewhere, it was some other state she went to, it was again into West Virginia. Right. And
although Joe, she's the only candidate so far who has said no to a Fox News town hall, which Bernie Sanders did and did really well.
Well, and again, I think you're absolutely right. And I think they can score points. Yeah. They can score points, and that's what I like about her. She has no problem going into the lion's den, and I think the DNC should be smart and have a 50-state strategy, not what they tried to do the last time.
She's also, I think she's also in some ways the toughest candidate out there in terms of the person who's going to take on Trump with the energy and the directness and the vehement, the fierceness. Yeah. She's really tough.
Frank, very quickly, Okay,
Yeah,
Julio,
just
I'll
say
come to you in a
one thing,
moment. I just want to get Frank's view on
yeah.
one quick thing right now. Elizabeth Warren's decision not to go on Fox News.
A mistake. I think it's a mistake. I think all these candidates, Donald Trump's never met a camera or a microphone he didn't like, and Bernie Sanders did do well, and he kind of he sort of embarrassed his Fox host because he got a big round of applause for a very progressive point that he was making. So she should go.
Okay, Julio, go ahead.
Yeah, really quickly on the immigration issue that Amy brings up, I think it's a little bit too simplistic to say that Americans are for or against something. Recent polling would suggest, and it is, and I'm talking about Pew, that most Americans in this country want the undocumented population to become, to achieve citizenship status or any side of legal status. So I think I think Biden in that case or in other Democratic candidates, they are being a little bit middle of the road. And I go back to Castro's plan, that it does seem it's not as radical as people think. We're not talking open borders here. Castro is very centrist, just like Biden. They both come from an Obama administration that actually was very tough on immigration and actually led in a lot of deportations. So I think it's a little bit simplistic to say that, well, he's pandering, when in fact, if you look at a growing Latino base in the Democratic Party, there's a lot of support for what a lot of these Democrats are doing on immigration.
And can I say this quick? I hate to use the R word, but don't leave racism out of this.
Right.
Because that's exactly what the Trump base is thinking. We don't want, when Laura Ingraham says, the demographic shift
Laura
and
Ingraham,
change.
she's a Fox News
Oh,
host, right?
please.
Yeah.
That's just pure racism.
Right. Julio, I want to stay with you for one other issue, and that is age. Both Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden, men in their 70s. On the other end of the age spectrum, we've got Pete Buttigieg. He's 37. In fact, he's been talking about age. He made this comparison between himself and Joe Biden. Let's watch this.
In one way, we've got a lot in common, right? I mean, he speaks to a kind of middle of the country. In another way, the contrast couldn't be more different, right? I mean, we're talking about generational change. We're talking about how there's no going back, how we got to come up with something that'll work for the next 40 years. And I think it just sits on a different foundation, what we talked about. But I admire him, for sure. I just think in the end, we're having different conversations.
So, Julio, there we have Buttigieg saying that and talking about himself and Joe Biden, having very different conversations. Is he right? Is Biden out of step with the party?
Well, it's interesting because it seems like people tend to forget, and I'm of the Generation X. I'm a 40-something. It's either you're a millennial or you're a baby boomer, and people tend to forget that people like Kamala Harris, Beto O'Rourke are Generation X candidates who are in between those generations, and no one's talking about the 40-somethings and the early 50-somethings. With that said, I think there is something to be said about Biden without sounding like ageist, that he might be a little bit out of touch. But the bigger question is, everyone's thinking that Bernie Sanders was never going to get any support this time around. When I remember when my daughter texted me, she's in college now. She was like, "Oh my God, he's running again," and now you're seeing that he's still getting support with young millennials. And the thing about Buttigieg is, he might be the shiny object right now in the room, but where's his policy? Where's his policy?
Go ahead.
Well, Anand, it reminds me
I'll get to you in a
Ronald
moment, Amy.
Reagan's.
I think what really matters here is not the candidate's age, but their chronological behavior. Okay? So if they're out there and they're projecting, I mean, how is it that Ronald Reagan in his 60s was a rock star among young conservative voters? How was it that Bernie Sanders last time was a rock star among young liberal voters? So I think it's how an older candidate presents. Is the time for the torch to be passed to a new generation? Arguably, but I'm telling you, when it comes down to it, when the shakeout happens, these Democrats are hungry and they want that White House back, and I think they're going to go where the energy is.
You can be older and cool.
Don't we know that, Joe? Don't we know that?
Give us hope.
Well, Anand,
Amy, go ahead.
Anand, I'm reminded of Ronald Reagan's famous put down, which is, I promise not to mention your youth and inexperience if you don't mention my age. I think that question can be put away pretty well.
Frank, let's talk very quickly. We've got a few minutes left about the Democrat Party. There's a bit of a split in the party, isn't there?
A bit of a split, yes.
A schism. You've got the progressive wing. You know, it's the flag bearer, of course, is Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. How important a role are they going to play, and who gets selected?
They're playing a very important role because of the dynamism they bring, because of the change they represent, and because of the sentiment that they tap into, which is a very vocal sentiment. And it's frustrating those in the middle. I had a conversation with also a newly elected member of Congress, a woman recently, and she said, I'm a centrist and I can barely get my voice heard. And yet we predominate in the newly elected members of Congress. So the progressive wing, the liberal wing is going to be vocal. It's going to give voice to the anger, to the impatience, to the youth that's out there in many ways. It also gives expression, I think, to something else, and that's really what's churning beneath all of this. The great issue in America, really, that's driving so much of this, I believe, is the issue of inequality in income and wages. Yes, President Trump was boasting about this full employment economy, but a lot of people are working and still not coming close to making ends meet.
Right.
And it's that the left, the liberal left, that's going to tap into that, I think, in a very persuasive way and push those in the middle.
Joe, very quickly, I've got 15 seconds. Are there any major
4 hours every day.
Are there any major risks for Democrats in choosing a progressive to fight Donald Trump?
Oh, that's not going to happen. Yeah, and I can do that in 5 seconds.
Okay,
That's
great.
not going to happen.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.